Okay, hello everyone. Today we are going to study American literature class number 3. As you remember, in the first class we offered the course outline with certain other things, and in the second class we talked about the beginnings, the colonial period, the Puritans, and how the Puritans gave America its shape for at least for 200 years of their perspective on life, which was religiously motivated and in a rigid manner of life understanding and practice. Today we are going to look at the democratic origins and revolutionary writers of literature. Why democratic origins? Why revolutionary writers in a course on American literature? History and literature are intertwined. You cannot separate one from the other. So you have to look at the history first in order to understand the dynamics that led to the literary phenomenon. Usually literature is not only shaped by a socio-historical era, it also shapes it. So it is like correlative objective of history. Okay? In this class, we are going to discuss the revolutionary writers like Washington Irving, Cooper, and Frono. And we will cover this period from 1776, the Revolution time, until 1820, where Romanticism started to hail from Europe into America. But first, I would like to talk about these beginnings that were extremely turbulent, because this is a group of people coming from a society that is entrenched in certain morals, religious tenets that are established through centuries. And these people are hectic, or they are in panic. They want to establish their own society, their own country, independent from all influences that were in Europe at the time. Let us take the example of literary writing after the revolution, where the Americans were exploring ways of establishing their own ways of literary writing. Did they succeed from the beginning, or was it a long period of writing until they reached some sort of independence from the mother country, i.e. England? And when was the moment that at certain point they started to deal with Britain as a foreign country, in the words of one magazine that we are going to read now? After it was their own mother country that gave them the language, their mother tongue, English. Okay? We will see. Now, the hard-fought American Revolution against Britain was the first modern war of liberation against a colonial power. You can note two things here. The first one is that it's a general note or a general remark. Was it really the first modern war of liberation against a colonial power? This is a question needs an answer. That needs an answer. The second thing, you can see how Americans are talking about the British as being colonialists. These people who believe that the British were colonialists of America, in fact, they themselves were colonialists. They were part of colonialist enterprise on the American soil. You see the irony. The colonialist calls the colonialist a colonialist while he is or she is a colonialist himself or herself. Okay? The triumph of American independence seemed to many at the time a divine sign that America and her people were destined for greatness. Note the word divine, godly sign. It is a sign from God that these people are great and destined, destiny. They call it in American literature the manifest destiny. It is good to go and search the manifest destiny, that God gave them this land and it is a promised land and it's a biblical land. And remember when we talked about William Bradford, who wanted to learn Hebrew in order to understand the language of God. This was one of the first colonists. Remember he was one of the first people to lay down the principles of the Declaration of the Independence through his compact that he wrote on Mayflower. Okay? So these people believed from the very beginning that their land is based on the order of gods, the order of heaven. Okay, and it is heaven that paved the way for them to colonize it, to liberate themselves later on from the British rule and establish their own country on the American soil. But this narrative needs support. The support usually comes from books. And books, one, are rare in America at the time because it was still a growing country and people at the first stage of their independence were curious to secure a level of life living. They want to live first and then turn to book writing and book reading. So the second aspect is that Britain was the hub of publishing at the time, and whatever is written in Britain found its way to all corners of the world, including America. Now, these people couldn't write because of two things: because they were a growing nation. Second, because books were exported from Britain to them and they could read English. This is why it took them so long until they started to pay attention to the fact that they needed their own literary culture. American books were harshly reviewed in England. Even when an American writer writes something, his work or her work is harshly reviewed in England. Remember when we talked about Anne Bradstreet? She published her work, although based in America, she published her work in England. This can tell you how much these people were connected to their mother country that will soon they will call foreign country. In order to establish, you have to establish your other in order to have your own identity. Okay? Americans were painfully aware of their excessive dependence on English literary models. Yeah, clear. The search for a native literature became a national obsession. They want their own literature. They want their own writing, but they are crippled because they are a newly established nation. They still need a lot to establish a culture, to establish a literary culture. Okay? They are not Europe that had been for thousands of years writing and producing knowledge, philosophy, etc., etc. They need their own. The Americans now, once they are independent, they want their own Shakespeare. They don't have Shakespeare. They don't have Charles Dickens. They don't have David Hume, philosophy. They don't have Kant. They don't have Samuel Johnson. All these names, all these masterpieces, okay, are missing in the American example. Okay, they need people who make an American identity through literature. This is why people like Washington Irving, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was like a precious stone that was found in the desert to the Americans because he was one of the first people to give America its own shape as a nation that has an identity and that can produce literature of its own, okay, or on its own. Look at this. At the time the Americans were aware of their weakness. This is a quote by a magazine at the time saying, dependence is a state of degradation. Degradation, if something is suffering from degradation, it is not happy. Somebody is not happy with his status in society. Okay, انحطاط. Okay, fraught with disgrace, shame. Okay, and to be dependent on a foreign mind. The foreign mind here is the English mind. The foreign mind, for what we can ourselves produce, is to add to the crime of indolence, laziness. This magazine considers indolence a crime, the weakness of stupidity. You can see how much these people were in dire need to have their own literature, to have their own literary production. But cultural revolutions, unlike military revolutions, cannot be successfully imposed, but must grow from the soil of shared experience. This is the thing. Of course, they won the independence, but they cannot have a huge pile of written literature next day after independence. This cultural revolution takes time until it is already fully fledged. Okay? It would take 50 years of accumulated history for America to earn its cultural independence and to produce the first great generation of American writers. These include Washington Irving, the one we are going to focus on today and who is considered the father of American literature, James Fenimore Cooper, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great transcendentalist, and his colleague Henry David Thoreau. These were the first people to start to give America its own picture or its self-conception as an independent nation culturally and literally. Revolutionary writers, despite their genuine patriotism, they were patriot, okay, nationalist, were of necessity of self-conscious, and they could never find roots in their American sensibilities. They had to read their English contemporaries. They had to read English books because they don't have predecessors. Their predecessors, in fact, are in England. As we've mentioned, they don't have metaphysical poets. Remember Anne Bradstreet? Anne Bradstreet was much influenced by American writers? No, by English writers, metaphysical poets like Spencer, like Marvell, like John Donne. Okay? So these writers, in fact, started to crystallize their own literary writing of a mixture of what they had read in English back home in England and the shared experience of the American soil. And the good expression of this, in fact, is Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Okay? Now, the absence of adequate copyright laws was perhaps the clearest cause of literary stagnation. If you write, nobody will care about what you write, and anybody can take your writing and ascribe it to himself or to herself because there is no copyright. Okay? And usually, writers in America would pay for the printers who print and circulate their own work. And this was a burden on the writer. If a writer doesn't receive a sponsorship, then he or she is in trouble. American printers pirating English bestsellers understandably were unwilling to pay an American author for unknown material. Yeah, here is a problem. If an American printer finds it easier for him to siphon a book written by Charles Dickens without any copyright laws and circulate it in America under the name of Charles Dickens, using the name of Charles Dickens or Thomas Hardy or Charles Bronte, okay, or John Keats or William Wordsworth, Coleridge, all these names were circulating in America without any restrictions, without much hustle, without much financial hustle on the part of the printers. So why he or she, the printer, takes the trouble to publish things by an American writer who is unknown and leave the fortunes that come to him through printing known writers such as Charles Dickens and John Keats and their contemporaries at the time. So they opted for this easy way of printing, of cultural production and circulation. Okay? The American Enlightenment. Now, after the Revolution, we come to the time of Enlightenment. Enlightenment was a response to Puritanism. Puritanism was rigid, religious, deeply rooted in social traditions that were against creativeness in writing and restricted its production in sermons and religious speeches in churches, and they didn't take note of, or they didn't pay attention to other forms of writing rather than poetry that is mostly religious. Okay? Now, the Enlightenment came as a response to this, and people started to question Puritanist values. Okay? The 18th century American Enlightenment was a movement marked by an emphasis on rationality. After the unseen was the norm. Rationality to refer to your mind, to be intellectual mind that questions everything. Rationality rather than tradition, scientific inquiry instead of unquestioning religious dogma, and representative government in place of monarchy. So, Enlightenment preferred democracy now. They don't want a king. They wanted a president. They didn't want a kingdom. They wanted a republic, and it is republic. Okay? And they refused to accept anything without scientific inquiry. They wanted to establish a new era of democratic understanding of life, democratic practices. And here we start with Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers and writers were devoted to the ideals of justice, liberty, and equality as the natural rights of man. While Puritanism provides for listening to your priest, indulgences, and if you do a bad thing, then you are going to be punished, whether you are innocent, whether you are not innocent. Okay? These are the tenets of Enlightenment: justice, liberty, and equality. Nobody is above the other. Okay? All equal before law. This man is one of the pioneers of Enlightenment. His name is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a versatile man. He was a printer, he was a writer, he was a trader, and he was one of the first people to succeed to have their books circulated simply because he had the financial ability to distribute his books. The political pamphlet, we talked about books. On the way to books, they started with the pamphlet. The pamphlet is something lesser than the book. Okay, المنشورات, okay, المطويات. One of the first people to write and to publish and circulate their own ideas through the pamphlet is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is a very important name because he was one of the first people to write about human rights and common sense. The passion of revolutionary literature is found in pamphlets, the most popular form of political literature of the day. Over 2,000 pamphlets were published during the revolution. Okay? And one of these great pamphleteers is Thomas Paine. His Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies in the first 3 months of its publication. It is still rousing today. The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind, he wrote in this Common Sense. By the way, Thomas Paine was as great as any writer, but he died in poverty. Unfortunately, the same example of people who wrote it during the revolutionary times. And it is said that he was the first to use the term human right that is used today abundantly. Okay? Who's this? This is Thomas Paine, by the way. Writers of fiction. Remember that during the Puritan time, writers focused on poetry, sermons, religious speeches in churches, etc., etc. Now they started to follow the steps of the English fiction writers. The first important fiction writers widely recognized today, Charles Brockden Brown, Washington Irving, and James Fenimore Cooper, used American subjects, historical perspectives, the themes of change, and nostalgic tones. These are the first to write from an American perspective, okay, using their own lives, okay, with nostalgic tones. Nostalgia is to feel that you are longing for a certain past. But did they have a past? This is the question. Did they really have a past? Each person has his own past. But does a whole nation that is in the beginning have a past? This is a good question to contemplate. Now, Washington Irving, 1789 to 1859, he was the youngest of 11 children born to a well-to-do New York merchant. Born to a well-to-do New York merchant family, Washington Irving became a cultural and diplomatic ambassador to Europe, like Benjamin Franklin and Nathaniel Hawthorne. These people were also diplomats as well, specifically Benjamin Franklin. He was the ambassador of America in France. Through friends, he was able to publish his sketchbook simultaneously in England and America. They needed England. They wanted their works to be known in England because England was the hub of the cultural world at the time, okay? And he obtained the copyright payment in both countries. That is good for him. The sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Irving's pseudonym, his name Geoffrey Crayon in writing, contains his two best remembered stories, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Sketch aptly describes Irving's delicate, elegant, yet seemingly causal style, and the crayon suggests his ability as a colorist or a creator of rich, nuanced tones and emotional effects. In the sketchbook, Irving transforms the Catskill mountains along the Hudson River north of New York City into a fabulous magical region. Hudson River is very famous. It separates New Jersey from New York, and here in this story, this place is turned into a magical place. It's turned into a fabulous place that is full of stories. Irving gave America something it badly needed. What is it? In the brash, materialistic early years, an imaginative way of relating to the new land. He invented a tradition that connected these people to the land. They don't belong, they made them belong. Okay? He made them belong. No writer was as successful as Irving at humanizing the land, endowing it with a name and a face and a set of legends. Legends are crucial element of tradition invention. They are needed. They are narratives that make the society coherent, that everybody can tell to himself and to the others, and eventually make a whole tradition of belonging, tradition of nation. Now, with these elements in mind, I want you to go home and think of what Irving did to America, how he forged literature in America that gave America its own picture, that gave America its own self-perception or self-conception, that we are Americans, we are different, we have our own tradition, cultural tradition, literary tradition, etc., etc. There is a word I mentioned in passing, but I want you to take care of when you study, which is related to Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, which is transcendentalism. I hope you sit down and look at transcendentalism, and we are going to situate it within the Romantic school of literature in America. Okay, for now, thank you and good luck.